Welcome to Sino-Warfare with Ralph D. Sawyer. Qin's Wall is often called the First Great Wall, but the contemporary name was Wanlicheng, which means 10,000 li wall. Depending upon the length of the li, commonly said to be about a third of a mile, it should have extended more than 3,300 miles. While the wall's mystique has grown over the centuries, the dramatic discovery of the Qin terracotta soldiers has recently piqued renewed interest. Even as the first Qin emperor was implementing a series of consolidation and control measures after finally having conquered the realm in 221 BC, he had the noted commander Meng Tian undertake a three-part effort to protect and integrate the north and northwest. It consisted of roads intended to improve transportation and communication, the subjugation and elimination of Xiongnu groups populating the contiguous region, and fortifying the northern perimeter with walls. While not as grandiose as the Great Wall, the Qin version is remarkable in having been undertaken with a fraction of the Ming's populace. It can also be considered the first attempt to completely demark the Huaxia, or Chinese, from the barbarian realm. During the first stage, roughly 221 to 215 BC, Meng Tian refurbished, augmented, and linked Zhao, Yan, and Qin's old frontier walls. He was reportedly allotted 300,000 troops for this and his two other tasks. And even though he was forced to commit suicide because of his brother's interference in the imperial succession, during the second stage, 214 to 210, the state directed its efforts to erecting walls that would protect and allow the control of recently conquered areas where new administrative districts were being established. 500,000 men were reportedly mobilized for the work, and another 500,000 assigned to support. While these figures probably reflect the total employed over the 5 years, rather than at any one time, the project inflicted great hardship on the populace and caused widespread unrest. Now, depending upon the terrain and the strength of the exterior threat, the height, width, and composition of the walls varied, but they normally consisted of tamped earth with small stones or layers of faggots inserted to provide strength, especially in arid areas subject to wind erosion. Average height may have been 12 feet or more, with proportionate but comparatively narrow width. In accord with that era's strategic thinking, the wall integrated an extensive array of tactically emplaced signal towers, watchtowers, forts, and guard stations. They numbered in the hundreds. Recovered bamboo strips indicate it was well administered. After the Qin was overthrown, the Western or former Han allowed the wall to deteriorate until the reign of its famous martial emperor, Han Wudi, who conducted 11 campaigns at the end of the 2nd century BC with comparatively mobile forces that numbered up to 200,000 and included significant cavalry components. They achieved dramatic victories and contributed to the conquest of numerous peoples and the opening of the Silk Road. Even though the Han relied more upon aggressiveness than static defenses, under Wudi efforts were still made to revitalize the Qin Wall and undertake other defensive measures, such as his building forts. Han also employed marriage and tribute relations, subversion, other economic measures, and they established military agricultural colonies to lessen the burden on the central treasury. This was a necessity, as much as a deliberate strategic policy, because the steppe campaigns depleted the state's fiscal resources. After recovering from the convulsion that had sundered the Han dynasty into two, the later or Eastern Han made some improvements in the fortified lines, but only early on. However, the really astonishing pre-Ming development was the inclination of the so-called barbarian regimes that developed in the north and managed to occupy significant Chinese terrain to embrace perimeter fortifications in their quest to thwart invasions by newly emergent, more aggressive groups out on the steppe. This is at least partly because their vital cavalry and combat skills eroded to the point that extinction loomed as they embraced agriculture and they became increasingly sedentary and even cynicized. Northern Wei and its short-lived successor Northern Qi therefore both mobilized enormous numbers to erect surprisingly extensive border fortifications along lines that would later be adopted by the Great Wall. In both cases, several efforts were required, and they each completed over 1,000 miles of wall. Wei even used them to replace a line of 6 large forts that had formerly demarked and supposedly protected the border. Their efforts were subsequently imitated by Liao and Qin during the late Tang and Song. Not only were they extensive, they were also innovative, and parts were reportedly refurbished during the construction of the Ming Dynasty Great Wall. They also largely employed stone and brick facing. In the interval between Wei and Qi and Liao and Qin, the brief Sui dynasty built walls in the northeast, and they also conducted 3 aggressive campaigns into Korea that deployed upwards of 500,000 men in several prongs, as well as a major sea component. Their campaigns and associated wall building required hundreds of thousands of laborers, imposed onerous taxes, and bankrupted the state, causing widespread unrest that eventually contributed to the dynasty's overthrow. Now the Tang, in turn, sought to restore China's ancient imperial glory by aggressively campaigning in the steppe. Their battles with the Turks resulted in recovering control of Central Asia, though later they were less successful against the Khitan. Following a hiatus in the Song, which was more inclined to appeasement than expending funds for defense, and then a century of Mongol rule, patriotic forces managed to drive their conquerors out and regain control of the realm, though not without years of multi-party conflict. This brings us at last to the expansive and exorbitantly expensive Great Wall, as it's commonly now known. While it's obvious that the Great Wall actually runs somewhat to the interior and isn't simply a resurrection of the Qin forerunner, reconstructions of the actual line have prompted considerable controversy despite advances in sensing and aerial survey. There is, of course, no lack of information and photos on the internet, including a discovery program in which I offer some thoughts in front of the wall itself. So rather than simply duplicate the basic information found on the internet about its size and its course, we'll ponder the military aspects. Although the Mongols were eventually forced out, the Ming felt compelled to build the Great Wall to prevent their return after a series of generally less than successful campaigns out into the steppe, including one that resulted in the Tumu incident, which is described in our third talk on aquatic warfare, and in which hundreds of thousands men were lost, as well as the emperor captured. The Great Wall was therefore conceived more as a desperate measure than part of an aggressive strategic defensive, and thus undertaken out of failure rather than strength, as was the case with earlier walls. Built in several discontinuous stages, the Ming Wall differed considerably from earlier tamped earth walls in consisting of lightly compacted earth and rubble piled between opposing brick, sometimes stone faces. And in its extravagance, the Ming even employed marble in some sections. Bricks were convenient to employ, but they had to be produced, and the terrain contoured to accommodate flat rectangular blocks, whereas sand and soil would simply fill in any undulations in the ground. The use of dimensioned stones or pavers for the foundation also increased the cost considerably because the stones had to be quarried, shaped, and transported. And while gathering rocks doesn't require that sort of effort, considerable skill is needed to successfully build a solid wall with them. Mortar was employed, a lime-based coating sometimes used to protect exposed surfaces, especially those of tamped earth. In some areas, ditches and moats were added to the exterior, and a lower interior wall built for refuge in exigency. In aggregate, at least 1 million people were compelled to participate in the effort over the decades, though far lesser numbers were mobilized at any one time. Many of them became seriously debilitated or perished, spawning great unrest. In addition, the massiveness of the undertaking severely disrupted the realm's agricultural and other activities, especially in the wall's general vicinity. Now, the Ming Wall seems great and grandiose, not just because of its imposing size and its successful exploitation of the terrain, but also because of the extensive use of brick and stone, because they give it an aura of extreme solidity. Moreover, it has a strongly aggressive character in having integrated military forces, forts, transport, and communications from the outset, rather than simply relying on static walls for passive protection. As is well known, following less than glowing success in actively campaigning out in the steppe, the surpassing commander, Wu Zejun, submitted a memorial in 1471 AD that advised exploiting the strategic advantages of the frontier topography to create a continuous defensive line along the border. The Ming history summarizes the results as follows. Having mobilized the troops, starting at Qingxueying in the east and extending to Huamachi in the west, some 1,771 li, you cut down the heights and built walls and dug moats below, and connected them all together in a continuous structure. Every 2 or 3 li he placed watchtowers. At the military outposts, he deployed prepared roving scouts. And in the empty places between the outposts, he erected low walls that had a ratio of 2 feet of height to 1 in extent, in the shape of a basket in order to observe the enemy and avoid archers. In all, he built 11 bastions, 15 beacon towers on the border, 78 minor beacon towers, and 819 outposts using 40,000 troops in less than 3 months. Completed in 1474 at about 566 miles in length, it's a remarkable achievement. Nevertheless, the short time interval and limited number of troops employed suggest the structure didn't realize the solidity or precision of China's early city walls. This explains why, just 20 years later, the line was already thought to have decayed to the point of being nearly unusable, despite having proven relatively successful and thwarted a major invasion. A separate memorial on what might be termed the dynamic employment of temporary fortifications shows Yu conceived of the wall as a means to halt mobile steppe attackers long enough to create the opportunity to counterattack. Much as Li Jing in the Tang and Zhang Zisca in the west, he believed large chariots, or more likely wagons, could then be circled to form an impregnable barrier outside the wall. When the barbarians gather their masses and ensconce themselves opposite us, their bows and arrows limit their skill to 100 paces, whereas our guns and cannon have awesome power that reaches out 300 or 400 paces. If we remain in a standoff for a long time, they will disperse to raid the area, at which time we can send the army forth. Some of our men will block their rampaging cavalry. Others strike those near their tail who are slow in returning. Although Yu's walls are better known, during this first stage of construction, the noted commander Wang Yue simultaneously built an additional separate wall that stretched for 387 li, or 129 miles. Thereafter, construction continued intermittently for another century and a half, until the Great Wall assumed its now well-documented expanse. Now, anyone who stood outside it, especially the more awesome sections that run atop the mountain ridges, is invariably struck by how difficult it would be for an inexperienced climber to ascend the heights, even with the aid of grappling hooks and ropes or shaking ladders. The hail of stones and arrows that invariably confronted assailants would therefore seem to have precluded any possibility of success. Nevertheless, clandestine nighttime ascents and daytime masked assaults sometimes succeeded. Now, as soon as any of the enemy's soldiers gained the top of the wall, the tactical situation immediately changed, because they could mount flanking attacks against defenders whose main protection, the waist walls, were oriented outward. While archery would still be deadly at short range, and it could still be employed, imperial troops were often ill-equipped for close combat with barbarian fighters wielding spears and sabers. The weakest points in the wall, and thus invariably the real targets, remained the many gates that allowed merchants and travelers to pass through, and provided access to the exterior for imperial military forces, whether they were dispatched for local patrols or expeditionary campaigns. Attempts were therefore made to harden them with pits, projections, moats, and other reinforcements. Next in vulnerability were the earthen portions out in the northwest, especially those in the arid areas. A horde of attackers could easily destroy 100 meters of tamped earth with simple tools in just an hour. In Ming times, successfully defending the wall therefore depended upon the manpower available. Even if the wall afforded the defenders a theoretical 10-to-1 advantage, a nominal attacking force of 10 or 20,000 steppe cavalry wouldn't confront more than a few hundred defenders, possibly far less depending upon employment and attrition in unit strength. In the absence of advance warning, the critical issue becomes response time, as we previously discussed. If the nearest cavalry contingent had to race 5 miles, they couldn't possibly arrive in less than 30 minutes, given the average horse can't sustain a gallop for more than about half that distance, and the soldiers had to saddle, mount, and armor themselves and their horses. Groups further away naturally took far longer. This shows the difficulty, even impossibility of matching numbers with invaders who sometimes reached 100,000. Successful feints and sudden shifts in the point of attack further undermine concerted response, as could disaffection and subversion, both of which played a crucial role in the Jurchen's penetration of the wall near Shanhaiguan in 1629, which doomed China to 3 centuries of subjugation. Thank you for watching.